Next, we'll look at William Perry's theory of cognitive development. William Perry defines 9 positions as students progress through these different ways of defining knowledge and ways of knowing. So the first one we refer to as dualism. And in these 2 stages, or in these 2 positions, knowledge is very dichotomous, where we have only right or wrong, and that is it, right? There's really no gray area. There is absolute truth and absolute false, and there's nothing in between. And the way that we determine whether something is right or wrong is by referring to an external authority. Okay, that begins as our parents in our early life, and then in the context of higher education, this external authority is our professors, right? So we enter higher education thinking that our professors are the holders of all that is good and holy in terms of knowledge, and that they have all the right answers, and that if 2 of them disagree, then that must mean that one of them is right and one of them is not right, and whoever is not right is inferior to the other. So then we progress into this multiplicity stage, where we begin to realize that there is a bit of gray area, and there are multiple perspectives, right? So we have multiple perspectives. And we begin to see that things aren't always necessarily all right or all wrong, and we begin to appreciate the concept of varying opinions, and we begin to appreciate the concept of everyone being entitled to their own opinion. And then we move into this state of relativism, right? And this is where we really begin to see the most fundamental shift in this whole process, right? We have a flip of our locus of control being external to internal. So here we develop this internal locus of control, where we no longer have this need to look to external authorities to tell us what is right and what is wrong, because there's not necessarily always a right or a wrong answer, right? Everything is kind of relative to the context of the situation, and very seldom is there ever a very cut and dry right or wrong answer. So then we finish out these 9 positions in what Perry refers to as stages of commitment. So in these stages, students begin to realize that they need to form meaningful professional and personal relationships, and that these relationships are based upon and contribute to a person's identity, and that these relationships take commitment. One of the biggest takeaways that kind of I take away from Perry's theory is this idea that you begin to develop these new ways of knowing and new ways of making meaning of the world, and you begin to see that things are relative, and you begin to see that there are multiple perspectives, and you meet people from other cultures, and kind of expand your horizons a bit. And as a result of this, you have these new relationships that are based on these new ways of comprehending the world, and this really kind of creates some issues for a lot of people, when they return home maybe for Christmas or for Thanksgiving after a year or so in college, and they see, oh man, this relationship that I had with this person for a long time is no longer going to work for me, because I now think a lot differently. And that happens to a lot of college students when they kind of get out and expand their horizons a bit. It strains some relationships with friends and family who still kind of hold those same ways of viewing the world as they always have. This particular theory has been criticized for a few different reasons. Rightfully so. So this study, the findings of this study were based off a sample size that was less than 30, right? So N is less than 30. That means there was less than 30 participants in this study. The study took place at Harvard in 1968. So imagine what your sample looks like at Harvard in 1968. You had straight, white, male, upper income level individuals, right? Every single one of these less than 30 individuals in this study fell into the category of being affluent, straight, white males. So that's another reason why you begin to see over time, like I mentioned earlier, you have all of these kind of subdomains now where you have people have elaborated on these theories and created theories that are specific to women and specific to those identifying as homosexual, those identifying as transgender, and different things. So, and there's always going to be criticism of any research, and most of the time rightfully so, and in this case is no exception. A sample size of less than 30 of a very homogeneous group, there's reason for criticism there. So moving on to Marcia, Baxter, Magolda's self-authorship theory. This theory was developed in a longitudinal study which took place over the course of about 30 years. It started with 200 college-age students, and Baxter Magolda continued to interview these students periodically over the course of a 30-year period. So she started with 200, and by the end of the 30-year study, she had dwindled down to a little less than 40 participants. In terms of validating your research, a longitudinal study that lasts 30 years and has a diverse population of or a diverse sample in terms of race and gender, there's a lot less criticism here than, say, with William Perry's study. So self-authorship is really kind of divided into kind of two questions. What are we developing, and how are we developing it? So the left side over here, you have what are we developing, you have cognitive development, intrapersonal, and interpersonal. So, if you've noticed, you see a lot of the same things kind of repeating themselves over and over here with cognitive, intrapersonal, interpersonal. One of the easier ways to kind of visualize this theory is to look at these three domains: cognitive, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and where self-authorship is right here in the middle, the intersection of those three domains. That's where we find self-authorship. And within each of these domains, as we develop cognitively and we answer the questions of how do I come to know what I know, I transition from external formulas to a crossroads stage to what is viewed as self-authorship, and we'll talk about each one of those here in a second. And then in the next domain, when I begin to answer these questions of who am I and what do I use to create a definition of myself, again, I begin with following external formulas, this crossroads phase, and then I end up in self-authorship, interpersonal development. How do I make my place in the world? How do I make meaning of the world around me? What is the nature of my relationships with other people? Follow external formulas, crossroads, and self-authorship. So each one of your three domains, you progress through each one of these three stages. So the following external formulas. Again, we're looking externally to authority figures in the higher education setting. Those authority figures are usually going to be professors, and we're looking for them to tell us what is right, what is wrong, and who we are. Then we have this crossroads phase where we begin to say, maybe I don't need to be looking elsewhere to have people tell me what's right and wrong, and to have people tell me who I am. And then we get to the point where we're able to be the author of our own lives, right? And we're able to decide for ourselves, who we are on our own, and decide what kind of people we want to have relationships with, and how we want those relationships to go. And we know what our beliefs are, and what our values are, and who we are as people. And from self-authorship, Marcia, Baxter, Magolda, and a few of her colleagues developed what is called the learning partnership model. And the learning partnership model is probably the best example of the alignment of student development theory with academics that we have seen to date. What the learning partnership model does is basically lays out a framework for you to be able to kind of develop self-authorship within the higher education setting, and specifically within an academic setting. The learning partnership model is fairly complex and could be a whole presentation in and of itself. So we'll just kind of mention it here as being significant.